本期视频是油管一档著名播客节目的直播节选，节目嘉宾对此次美国国务卿访华的结果进行预测，表示在目前美国对抗气氛如此浓厚的背景下，很难有实质性的进展。何况中国早就洞察了对手的企图，绝不会退让，也绝不会妥协。我们看看他们是怎么说的吧。
Then we had Blinken's trip to China, and it's a war. It's definitely an economic war, without a doubt. And I think it's gonna. I think the direction is for this thing to get hot. I don't know when, but let's hope not. But wow, what a trip from Blinken to China. So Alexander, what are your thoughts on everything that's happening in the world?
Blinken's trip to China is the big news of this week. Can I just say, you're absolutely right about where we're going. It is absolute disaster. It is a complete train wreck. The Chinese have rushed out a readout of the meeting between Blinken and she will come to in a moment, but you can see there what the Chinese are saying. We've not yet had the Chinese readout of the meeting between Blinken and Wang Yi, but we're no doubt going to get that from the Chinese soon. But it's exactly what you said. We're now in a full-scale confrontation between China and the US. And looking back, I'm going to suggest something, which is that the $61 billion that was that appropriation for Ukraine is the least important thing that happened on Saturday. It's money which has already been largely spent on Ukraine. It's not going to change the outcome of the war. We've discussed that in various programs. The real important thing is the confrontation with China. The money for Taiwan, the Chinese had already said, Taiwan for us, first red line, which mustn't be crossed. China won't sit on its hands if it is. That's what the Chinese said. That's what they said to Biden just 3 weeks ago. And we've now had an $8 billion appropriation for Taiwan. Secondly, the TikTok ban, seizing a Chinese asset, trying to get the Chinese to divest themselves of it. That hasn't happened. They're now going to seize the asset. The Russian asset steal. Now, I think this is a point which people haven't grasped.
You're talking JP Morgan, right, Alexander?
Well, there's the JP Morgan thing, which the Russians have done.
Right.
But it's what this appropriation debt, the $5 billion that they're taking of Russian assets in the US. What that is doing, yes, it's putting pressure on the Europeans, absolutely. But it is also providing a precedent and a legal mechanism for the seizure of foreign assets in the United States. And whose foreign assets are being targeted? It's not difficult to guess, it's China. That's what that's principally about. So we can see that all of these things line up together. And of course, we have spy mania in Germany about Chinese spies. Maximilian Krah, AfD politician. We've actually did a program with him, Glenn Deason and I. You can find it on the Duran. One of his people arrested on suspicion of being a Chinese spy, Chinese spy mania. And one of the results is a massive expansion of the FISA rules to allow even wider surveillance. So these are the really big events. And what ties them all together is China. So we have Blinken going to Beijing. He takes this incredibly tough line with the Chinese. He's basically talking about sanctions. And it must be said clearly, what Blinken is doing is he's using Ukraine, the conflict there, as a pretext to impose sanctions. That decision is not connected with the war in Ukraine. Not really. It's all about the economic war between the United States and China. And the second point about this is the Chinese furious about this. He has a tough meeting with Wang Yi. He then has another meeting with, throws the book at him. And if you read the readout, the Chinese readout, he repeatedly says to Blinken, you're telling me one thing, you've been telling me one thing all this time, and you are doing the opposite. You are saying you want good relations, and you're destroying those relations. Where there is no progress, there is regress. There's actually a specific statement in the readout of say that countries like the United States and China should not lie to each other. They should not say one thing and do the opposite. And you can see that the relations now have, to all intents and purposes, and in fact, come apart. It is an absolute complete train wreck. And we are now in a straightforward confrontation between China and the United States. There's another aspect about this appropriations bill that we saw last Saturday, and it's been made by various Republicans, which is that the way it is constructed, it ties the hands of any future president, including, of course, Donald Trump, if he's elected in November. So if he goes back on some of these decisions that have been made in these appropriations, he now risks finding himself in an impeachment situation. So, I mean, it is terrible what has happened. It's extraordinary. And it was prefigured, looking back, by a really incredible article that appeared in Foreign Affairs a few days ago, written by a man called Pottinger, who I believe was one of George W. Bush's national security team, in which he said that we mustn't manage the relationship with China. We must go out to win. And that effectively means engineering regime change in Beijing.
Talk about China stockpiling for like the last 17, 18 months.
Yeah.
Sold everything.
Absolutely.
They're stockpiling on everything. So they're preparing for what's about to come. And it would be impossible for China to even give an inch to the US demands. If that were to happen, then it would be lights out, game over for China. I mean, that's what we're talking about here.
Absolutely, of course it would. I mean, let's say they agree to divest themselves of TikTok. Then, of course, as night follows day, they'd have further demands to divest themselves of more companies and assets that they own in the United States. So they can't do that. If they agree not to supply Russia with chips and machine tools as night follows day, more demands. China stops exporting other goods as well, stops buying Russian oil, stops trading with other countries that it wants to trade, stops exporting certain goods to the United States. They can't do that. They know perfectly well that they cannot do that. And they know also perfectly well that even if they did do that, the Americans, not the Americans, the Biden administration would simply come up with something else in order to sanction them, because sanctions are now baked in the cake. They are part of the policy. A decision was obviously made months ago, probably even before the San Francisco summit, to try to get this together and to do it before the election. I'm guessing that the US has been working, or rather the Biden team have been working in this direction for over a year. And as we discussed in our program, in one of our programs that we've recently done, it follows exactly the same copy book that they used in 2021 with the Russians. Threats followed by sweet talk. We want good relations with you. We want to put relations with you on a stable footing. A summit meeting in Geneva between Putin and Biden that seemed to go well. And then, of course, the reality is, once that's out of the way, once whatever obstacle is still in the way of moving forward with whatever it is you want to do, in this case, in the case of the Russians, once Merkel was out of the way, you move forward towards the confrontation, which exploded in February 2022. They're doing exactly the same thing with China. They set out on a line of confrontation. They strung the Chinese along a few more months. They had that meeting in San Francisco. They've now got the bill through Congress. They've now put themselves in a position where they can move forward. we have Blinken going to Beijing and basically telling the Chinese we're going to sanction you.
I'm having such a hard time trying to understand the logic to all of this. I really am, because it appears to me that China can really do a lot of damage to the U.S. economy. Yeah, yes, the U.S. can do damage to China, but I think the Biden White House is really they're making a horrific mistake here with escalation with China. I mean, Russia's one thing, and even with Russia, they're getting their ass handed to them. But China's just a whole nother deal. I don't understand this at all. I really am having a very difficult time understanding the logic from the Biden. It's almost as if they want to destroy the United States. They want to destroy the U.S. dollar.
It is a cataclysm.
That's what it looks like.
It's a cataclysmic mistake. By the way, we're also getting reports that, presumably the same people who are driving this are also apparently advising Donald Trump now, because there's apparently meetings going on within the Biden Trump team as well about sanctioning anybody who gets drawn into any Chinese financial or global trade arrangements. In other words, more sanctions, more threats, more pressure on all kinds of third parties as well. And clearly an attempt to isolate and break China. And it is cataclysmically wrong. You know what it reminds me of? And, I don't like to make these parallels. It's a parallel that I really would much rather not make. But it reminds me of German policy in 1941. The German leadership found themselves facing more problems than they expected. Things were going wrong in all kinds of directions. They weren't winning the war as quickly as they thought, and things weren't turning out in the way they wanted them to. So first they invade Russia, then incomprehensibly they declare war on the United States, supporting the Japanese. Eventually, by the end of 1941, they're at war with the United States, Russia, China, always forget them, and Britain as well. I mean, all the great powers, in other words, of the world lined up against them in order to sort out, because they went out and guns blazing in all directions to sort out their various problems. And of course, the Japanese at the same time did exactly the same thing. And well, as we know, we all know how that ended up with the Russians in Berlin, with the Americans in Tokyo, with a terrible devastation and disaster. I don't like to make this parallel. I don't want to talk in that way about the United States, a country for which I have expressed many times my deep and strong feelings of regard. But I mean, it's the only example of a country behaving like that I can think of.